wind was sharp, slicing through the night like a blade as Julian Hart pulled his sleek black Aston Martin into the gravel driveway of an old inn, hidden behind a curtain of pine trees. The headlights cut across a weather-worn wooden sign that flickered erratically in the rain, Willow Creek Inn. Though the letters C and K were barely hanging on, Julian shifted the gear into park but didn't move. The engine idled for a moment before he finally turned it off. The windshield wipers kept moving for a beat, brushing away the thin stream of water sliding down the glass. He didn't reach for the door. Not yet. He sat in the silence of his car, the soft patter of rain tapping gently against the roof. His hands rested on the steering wheel, motionless. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed a man far removed from the one that adorned magazine covers and conference stages. Tired eyes, stubble growing in where his morning routine used to live, and a sadness so deeply etched into his expression it felt permanent. Julian Hart, 45, tech mogul, once dubbed the mind behind the modern smart world. He had just walked out of a board meeting 2 days ago with a signed divorce settlement in his briefcase. 12 years of marriage to Isabel, over, signed, notarized, and sealed in silence. Not a dramatic ending, just a cold, well-organized undoing. He had planned to fly back to his Malibu estate, where a fridge full of untouched champagne and a staff that respected distance waited for him. But as he left the lawyer's office, something shifted. He turned off his phone, got into his car, and drove. No GPS, no destination, just the open road and the storm above. Somewhere along the miles, the world blurred into grays and greens. Then came the sign. Something about it, maybe its fading letters or the eerie glow, called to him like a whisper. He veered off the main highway and let the road guide him here. Rain fell harder now, as if trying to convince him to stay in the car. But Julian reached for the umbrella in the passenger seat, took a breath, and stepped out into the chill. The gravel crunched beneath his polished leather shoes, out of place in this forgotten corner of the world. He popped the trunk, pulled out a single, well-worn leather duffel, and looked up at the dark windows of the inn. Most were unlit. Only one faint light glowed from what seemed to be the front lobby. As he walked toward the entrance, he could feel the weight of the last few years pressing harder with every step. Success had never felt so suffocating. The silence of this place, far from the hum of city life, was strangely loud. And maybe, just maybe, that was what he needed. The wooden door creaked open with a soft chime, and Julian stepped inside, dripping with rain, but ready, unknowingly, for something to begin. Julian stood just inside the doorway, letting the warmth of the inn slowly wrap around his rain-soaked shoulders. The scent of old wood and something faintly floral, lavender, perhaps, mingled with the quiet stillness of the lobby. No other guests in sight, just the soft ticking of a distant grandfather clock and the sound of wind brushing against the windows. He didn't move right away. His eyes wandered across the dim space, the aged wallpaper peeling at the edges, a worn-out rug faded from decades of footsteps, and an armchair in the corner that looked like it had known stories too heavy to speak aloud. Julian set down his bag and exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. His chest still carried the pressure from the last 48 hours. The moment he signed the divorce papers, Isabel hadn't looked at him. Not with hate, not with regret, just nothing. Her signature was the final period at the end of a sentence they'd been too tired to rewrite. No argument, no drama, just two people who had slowly learned how not to see each other. He remembered how it used to be. She once called him my compass, always steady, always moving forward. He used to wake her up with coffee and bad jokes, the kind that made her roll her eyes and laugh anyway. She would leave notes in his laptop bag. "Knock 'em dead today, genius," or "Come home with sushi and that stupid grin of yours." But then came the missed dinners, the nights apart, the increasing space in their bed. They had drifted, but not from a storm, just from silence, quiet compromises, lingering expectations, unspoken disappointments. Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. a note he had written but never given her. It simply read, "I miss you. I just don't know how to reach you anymore." He had folded it and carried it for weeks, hoping for the right moment. It never came. Instead, they stopped trying, and slowly, what once was home turned into a beautifully decorated holding space for two successful individuals living parallel lives, avoiding friction, but also connection. He took out his phone. No notifications. Isabel had blocked him on social media. Her name still sat atop his favorite contacts list, untouched. Julian stared at the message thread, the last thing he had sent her. "I'm sorry it ended this way." No reply. He placed the phone face down on the counter and ran his hands through his hair, damp with rain and frustration. For all his millions, all his mind-blowing achievements, he couldn't fix the one thing that had truly mattered. For years, he had poured himself into building something visionary, and somehow he had let the foundation of his own life crack beneath him. Too busy to notice, too proud to admit. Now, all that was left was this quiet, forgotten inn and the ache inside his chest that refused to go away. A gentle chime echoed through the lobby as Julian stepped further inside, the old wooden door clicking shut behind him. The space was still, almost sacred in its silence, like a room that had learned how to listen better than speak. From behind a tall oak counter in the corner, a figure slowly emerged. She moved like time itself, deliberate, unhurried, and composed. Her hair was the color of frost, pulled back in a low bun. Thin-framed glasses clung to her narrow nose, and her sweater, once green, had faded to something softer, quieter, like moss on old stone. She looked at Julian, not with surprise, not even curiosity, but with something deeper, recognition. "Good evening," she said, her voice gentle, as if careful not to disturb whatever he had brought in with him. "Looking for a room?" "Yes," Julian replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Just for a few nights, if that's possible." "Always is," she said with a small smile and pulled out a large, worn registry book from beneath the counter. "Name?" "Julian Hart." She didn't flinch, didn't react to the name. Either she didn't know who he was, or didn't care. As she wrote, Julian noticed the grace of her movements. Her hands, though thin and delicate, moved with the kind of steadiness that only came from years of repetition. She filled out the page in precise, looping handwriting and slid the book toward him. "How long do you think you'll be staying?" she asked, still not looking up. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Can I pay daily?" "Of course." She reached beneath the desk and returned holding a key. Not a card, but an actual metal key, slightly tarnished, with a wooden tag carved with the number 27. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. And then she said it. "I've been expecting you." Julian froze. The key lingered between them, and for a moment the entire room felt like it tilted. Those were Isabel's words, back when love was still easy. She used to say them every time he came home early from a trip. "I've been expecting you," she would whisper, arms outstretched, eyes full of warmth. He pulled his hand back slowly. "Sorry, what did you say?" The woman looked at him with a quiet smile, one that almost seemed to say, "You already know." "I meant it's nice to have someone new around here," she replied, returning to the logbook. Julian nodded, though something unsettled stirred inside him. "Room 27 is just down the hall, last door on the right," she added. "My name's Beatrice. Let me know if you need anything. The inn's small, but it has its ways." He took the key, the bag, and take a deep breath. The hallway was dim, lit by wall sconces that cast long shadows across the faded floral wallpaper. Julian's footsteps were nearly silent against the old, wine-colored carpet. As he passed by closed doors, he felt as though the walls themselves held their breath, like this place had witnessed too many quiet breakdowns to interrupt one more. At the far end, room 27 waited. He unlocked the door with a soft click and stepped inside. The room was simple, almost austere, but undeniably warm in its own way. A double bed sat in the center, covered in a faded quilt patterned with forget-me-nots. Beside the window stood a small reading chair, angled perfectly toward the forest just beyond the glass. A delicate writing desk occupied the corner, and an antique wardrobe leaned slightly to one side, its wood the color of autumn. He set his duffel on the floor and let out a quiet sigh. There were no sleek speakers, no touch-screen panels, no buzz of technology here. Just the tick of a small analog clock and the faint scent of lavender mixed with old timber. Julian sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped between his knees, and then it hit him. The silence wasn't just in the room. It was inside him too. It rose slowly from his chest and tightened his throat. His vision blurred. He gritted his teeth, tried to swallow it back down, but it had waited too long. He leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, and the first sob escaped. A sound so raw, so human, it startled even him. He cried like someone who hadn't allowed himself to in years. Not the restrained, respectable sadness of a man with too much pride, but the full collapse of someone who had held it in too long. He cried for the 12 years they had built together, and for how quietly it had all unraveled. He cried for the Sunday mornings they used to spend reading in bed, for the inside jokes that had faded, for the anniversaries replaced by calendar reminders. He cried for Isabel, and for himself. The ache in his chest wasn't just about the ending. It was about all the small deaths that came before, the missed looks, the words unsaid, the doors that slowly closed, while both kept pretending nothing had changed. Julian lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, eyes staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling. The lavender in the air, once subtle, now felt like someone had left a memory behind just for him. His breathing slowed, and the sobs faded into shallow exhales. He thought of the wedding vows they had written themselves, to choose each other every day, and how somewhere along the way, neither of them had kept choosing. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to retreat. And just before the weight of exhaustion overtook him, a single thought surfaced and settled quietly in his mind. Money can build houses, but it can't make a home. With that, Julian drifted off into uneasy sleep, still broken, still lost, but for the first time in years, completely honest with himself. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the window, as if offering a lullaby of its own. And room 27, silent and still, watched over him like a keeper of sorrow and beginnings. For the next few days, Julian barely left room 27. The world outside went on. Wind brushing the pines, rain falling in slow rhythms. But inside, time seemed to stretch and bend. Mornings came as soft gray light through the curtains, and nights arrived without ceremony. He didn't count the days, only the silences between them. Each morning, a tray of food would appear outside his door. A simple breakfast, toast, fruit, warm tea, no knock, no voice, just presence. He didn't turn on his phone. He couldn't bear to scroll through shallow condolences or empty texts from business partners who had read about the divorce in the press. No calls from Isabel, none expected. Instead, he stared out the window for hours, watching the branches sway and drip. The stillness was unnerving at first. He wasn't used to being without a schedule, a briefing, a problem to fix. But gradually, the silence became a mirror, and in it, he began to see himself more clearly than he had in years. He thought about all the advice he'd heard since the separation. You'll bounce back. She was never on your level. You're better off, man. Travel, date, move on. They meant well, but none of them had known the quiet way love fades. None had sat through the slow death of laughter in the kitchen, or the hollow sound of "good night," said out of habit rather than warmth. Julian remembered the last time Isabel had really looked at him, not out of frustration or politeness, but with love. He couldn't place the date. That realization gutted him. There had been no great betrayal, no screaming match, just neglect. Routine mistaken for stability. Disconnection mistaken for peace. He remembered her once saying, It's not the big things that end relationships, it's the little things we stop doing. Back then, he'd nodded and gone back to replying to emails. Now those words rang like a bell in a cathedral of regret. One afternoon, he picked up the notepad from the desk in the corner. The pen was dry, but he pressed it to the page anyway, as if the motion alone might bring something back. I should have told you I missed you when I still had the chance. He tore the page out and folded it, placing it in his wallet right where her photo used to be. On the 5th morning, something shifted. He woke early, showered, shaved, carefully buttoned a navy blue shirt, one she had once said made him look less intimidating, more real. Not for anyone else, just for himself. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, examining the man looking back. The tiredness was still there, the grief, but beneath it, a flicker of something unexpected. Resolve. For the first time since arriving, Julian opened the door to room 27, not to receive a meal, but to step out. Somewhere deep in the forest behind the inn, the wind had changed. The dining room was small and quiet, nestled just off the main lobby. Morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. A single table in the corner was occupied by an elderly couple, speaking in hushed tones, their fingers lightly touching across the table, like two people who had learned how to stay. Julian stepped in, freshly shaven, dressed neatly, with a hesitance in his step, as if walking into a life he wasn't sure he still fit inside. Behind the counter stood Beatrice, arranging ceramic mugs on a wooden shelf. When she saw him, her face lit up, not surprised, not performative, but genuinely warm. "Well now," she said, setting down a cup, "it's good to see you, Mr. Hart. I was starting to wonder if the inn had swallowed you whole." Julian gave a small smile as he walked toward a table near the window, where he could see the garden and the tall line of pine trees beyond. "I think I needed to disappear for a while," he replied. Beatrice brought over a basket of still warm bread and a pot of dark roast coffee. He took a sip and let out a quiet sigh. "Did you bake these yourself?" "I always do," she said. "I believe small pleasures make the biggest difference." Something about her voice, the ease of it, the complete absence of judgment, unlocked something in him. He looked down at his coffee. "I just got divorced," he said quietly, as if saying it aloud still tasted foreign. Beatrice nodded, not shocked, not pitiful, just accepting. "Endings have a way of feeling heavier before they feel lighter," she said, sitting down across from him. Julian looked at her, the corners of his eyes tired but honest. "On the day I arrived, you said, 'I've been expecting you.' Why?" Beatrice smiled gently, stirring her own cup without drinking. "This inn," she said slowly, "has a curious habit. It draws people during times of transition, people who are in between something. I don't always know the details, but I recognize the signs." Julian studied her, unsure whether to be comforted or unnerved. And what signs were those? She met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "The silence around your soul. It's loud if you know how to listen." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Beatrice stood and returned behind the counter. After a moment, she added, "There's a path that starts just beyond the back garden, leads through the woods to a small lake. Not long, but quiet. Sometimes a walk helps the pieces settle." She turned, reached under the counter, and placed a small lunchbox on the table. "I made extra sandwiches," she said with a wink, "in case you get lost." Julian looked out the window again. The trees swayed lightly in the wind, almost like they were beckoning. He wasn't sure where the path led, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. The path behind Willow Creek Inn began where the trimmed grass ended. A narrow trail, barely wider than 2 footsteps, wound into the tall pines like a quiet invitation. Julian stepped past the weathered gate at the edge of the garden, the lunchbox from Beatrice tucked under his arm, and let the forest swallow him whole. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something older, moss maybe, or memory. Sunlight filtered through the trees in scattered beams, lighting the path in fragments, as if the forest insisted on revealing only what one was ready to see. Julian walked slowly, his polished shoes already coated in soil. No cars, no voices, no notifications. Just birdsong in the distance and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath his feet. As he walked deeper, something within him softened. And then memories came. Not in a rush, but in pulses, like waves. He saw Isabel again, not the Isabel in court, cool and composed, but the one from their first trip to Italy, laughing beside a gelato stand, chocolate on her lip, teasing him about being too serious. He remembered how she used to sneak tiny love notes into his briefcase before investor meetings. "Don't forget you're more than numbers." He'd smile every time he found one. He remembered how she'd come into the kitchen in the mornings, still half asleep, wrapping her arms around him from behind as he made her coffee. No words, just warmth. It was a ritual. One of those small, sacred things they never thought to protect. And then he remembered how they stopped. The notes disappeared. He stopped cooking. She stopped hugging. They began to orbit each other like planets too far apart to collide. Fewer glances, fewer smiles, more noise, less connection. He started staying later at the office. She began making dinner, for one. Julian paused in the middle of the trail and leaned against a pine tree, breath heavy, not from the walk, but from the ache those images brought. It hadn't been some dramatic explosion. Their love had unraveled one loose thread at a time. He thought of the last time she'd waited up for him. He had come home from a flight past midnight. She was on the couch, drowsy but waiting. He'd barely acknowledged her presence, just muttered, "Long day," and disappeared into the bedroom. She never waited up again. The forest opened up ahead of him, and there it was, a small lake, perfectly still, reflecting the canopy above. A weathered wooden pier stretched out over the water. A pair of ducks glided near the edge, like they too were remembering something. Julian sat on a fallen log and opened the lunchbox. Inside, 2 simple sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a note. Sometimes we have to lose something to understand its true worth. Other times we have to lose it to move forward. Wisdom is knowing which one it is. Beatrice. He stared at the handwriting for a long while. Maybe he hadn't been entirely wrong about Isabel. Maybe she hadn't been entirely wrong about him. But they had both stopped showing up. In that stillness by the lake, Julian finally accepted what had hurt the most. Not that their marriage had ended, but that he had let it fade without a fight. He closed his eyes, breathed in the forest air, and held that realization not as guilt, but as truth. The kind of truth you carry forward. Julian returned to the inn as the sun dipped low behind the treetops, casting golden light across the garden. The path back from the lake had felt shorter somehow, as if the weight he carried on the way in had lightened, just enough to make him walk a little taller. Inside, the inn was as quiet as ever, but now it felt less like emptiness and more like space. Space to breathe, to feel, to remember. As he walked down the hallway toward room 27, something caught his eye. A mirror, tall, old, with a brass frame slightly tarnished, leaned against the wall near the staircase. He could have sworn it hadn't been there before. Julian stopped and looked at his reflection. When he reasserted, not the public figure, not the polished millionaire with the carefully curated life. This was a man with tired eyes and a cracked heart. A man who had made mistakes. A man who, despite everything, still loved. And in that instant it hit him, not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow, aching truth rising from somewhere deep. He had not left Isabel because he didn't love her. He had left because he thought she no longer did. And perhaps she had done the same. He stared at the man in the mirror and whispered, almost to himself, "I gave up without trying." And then the tears returned. Not with rage, not even sorrow. This time it was grief for himself, for the version of him that stopped showing up, for the mornings he chose meetings over moments, for the days he mistook silence for peace, for the love he assumed would sustain itself without tending. He cried for the pride he had mistaken as strength, for the quiet ways he had disappeared while pretending to be present. And when the tears passed, what remained wasn't guilt, it was clarity. That night, he went down to the lobby. Beatrice was behind the counter, seated with an open book. She looked up as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment. "I think I'm leaving tomorrow," Julian said, lowering himself into the armchair nearby. She closed the book gently. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "No," he said, voice steady. "I found what I was avoiding." Beatrice offered a small nod, neither surprised nor satisfied, just knowing. "I realized," Julian continued, "that I still love her, that maybe we both gave up too soon." Beatrice stood and moved behind the desk, opening a small drawer. From it, she pulled a leather-bound journal and placed it gently in front of him. "The guests who stay in room 27 often leave something behind before they go, a thought, a lesson, a truth." Julian looked at the blank pages and then back at her. "I don't know if she'll even listen," he said softly. Beatrice smiled. "The heart doesn't ask for guarantees, Julian. It only asks that we tell the truth, if only once." Julian hesitated, then opened the book. The pages smelled faintly of thyme and pine wood. He took the pen she offered, and slowly, with the weight of everything he had lived and failed to live, he wrote, "Pride almost taught me how to live without love. But love, when it's real, teaches you how to return, without armor, without noise, with nothing but truth." He closed the journal gently, as though placing something sacred to rest. The next morning, Julian checked out of the inn. He didn't say much, just handed Beatrice the key to room 27 and thanked her with a quiet sincerity that said more than any long goodbye could. She simply nodded and placed a gentle hand over his for a moment, then turned back to her work. As Julian stepped into his car and drove away, the pines lining the road no longer looked like sentinels of solitude. They looked like witnesses to something being reclaimed. His heart beat harder the closer he got to the city. Every mile brought him closer to the door he once called home. He had rehearsed nothing, no grand speech, no guarantees, only the truth. He parked just outside her brownstone apartment. The windows were lit, curtains drawn back slightly, life happening on the other side. Julian stood at the door for longer than he should have. 3 knocks might have been too desperate, 1 would feel too rehearsed, so he simply rang the bell and let his heart race. Behind the door was the life he had left behind, the quiet conversations they never had, the late-night silences, the mistakes, the love still waiting, maybe buried, maybe gone. The door opened. Isabel stood there in a loose sweater and jeans, barefoot on the hardwood floor. Her frame was noticeably thinner, her collarbones more pronounced beneath the soft fabric. Her hair was tied up loosely, and her eyes, shadowed with sleeplessness, looked tired, hollowed by waiting, but not angry, just real. They stared at each other, neither knowing what to say. She didn't ask why he came. He didn't give a reason. He only asked softly, "May I come in?" She nodded and stepped aside. The air inside the apartment was familiar. The faint scent of sandalwood, the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, the creak of the same floorboard near the hallway. He followed her into the living room, where they once sat side by side, but miles apart. This time, they sat across from each other. The silence between them wasn't the cold distance of 2 people drifting apart. It was the stillness of 2 hearts trying to remember how to speak. Julian leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Isabel. I left because I thought you already had." She didn't speak, so he kept going. "I didn't fight for us, not really, and I thought you'd stop fighting too, but that wasn't love ending. That was just fear, pride, exhaustion." Still silence. "But if there's even a piece of you," he said, voice trembling, "that still believes in what we had, what we could have. I want to try again, not go backward, just forward, with more listening, less ego, more presence. There was a pause so long it almost ached. And then she reached for his hand. Their fingers met like they had before, years ago, when everything was still soft and unspoken. This time, it was different. This time, they understood the weight. "I don't want to repeat the past," she finally whispered. "But I never stopped hoping for something more." They didn't promise forever that night. They didn't need to. They promised one thing: to show up every day, to choose again and again. 3 years later, the sky above the garden was pale blue, dotted with clouds shaped like wishes. Soft laughter filled the air, the kind that only comes from children discovering flowers and bugs for the first time. Julian stood beneath the same archway where he had proposed 2 months ago, in the backyard of their new home. Their home. In his arms, one of their 2-year-old twin girls tugged gently at his tie, giggling. The other toddled over to Isabel, who crouched down, barefoot in a simple white dress, and scooped her daughter up with ease. They had named them Mira and June, born within a minute of each other, bringing chaos, purpose, and a kind of love that filled the quiet spaces they once couldn't stand. The ceremony was simple: just them, a few close friends, and Beatrice, who had come all the way from Willow Creek, standing in the back row with that same calm smile. Julian took Isabel's hand as their daughters squirmed happily in the arms of their godparents. He looked into her eyes and said, with tears he didn't bother hiding, "I never thought I'd get another chance to marry you. And now I know I was never meant to love anyone else." Isabel smiled, wiping a tear from his cheek. "You didn't find your way back to me, Julian. You chose to come back. That means everything." They exchanged vows, not grand, not perfect, just honest. "I choose you." Her again. Still. Always. The breeze carried their words into the trees, and for a moment, everything felt still. Like even time was pausing to listen. After the ceremony, as guests laughed and children played under string lights, Beatrice handed Julian a small, familiar object, a tarnished metal key with the number 27 carved into the wooden tag. "I thought you might want to keep it," she said. Julian looked at it, then at his daughters chasing bubbles in the garden, then at Isabel. "I already have," he replied. And as twilight settled over their celebration, Julian realized he had finally built something that no amount of wealth could buy. A home, not made of marble or glass, but of forgiveness, second chances, and hands that chose to stay.